This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast. And today I am here with my friend, Dr. Nathan Lents, who I have known on the social medias for many, many years. But this is the first time that we're actually talking face to face. We got a video on here that you don't see. Dr. Lents is a professor at John Jay College in New York City, and he's written some great books, Human Errors, Not So Different, Finding Human Nature in Animals. And his most recent book, which you guys should check out, I did read it. Very, for me, like the word dense is actually a compliment. There's a lot of facts in there, right? I like it. And I actually want to follow up on some of the literature that he, their stuff is my educational background or whatever. I haven't read some of this literature in 20 years. I want to know where it's at, right? But the book is The Sexual Evolution, a Provocative Look at Sexual Behavior Through the Lens of Evolution. So it's about sex, and we're going to talk about sex today, which I think most of my listeners are not asexual, so they will be interested in it. And if you are, that's fine. Hi, Noah. But in any case, so this is gonna be a fun conversation. And actually, so Nathan, you reached out to me because I didn't, and I don't usually do this in terms of responsive podcasts or whatever, but it was it's fine because your book is very topical. Con Carroll came on with Sex and the Citizen, which was about monogamy, a very pro-monogamy book, talked about evolutionary psychology and anthropology, and then also a lot of policy. Can you talk about I don't know, let's just start out, okay? Because I want to get into the brass tacks and details of your book, but talk about your reaction to Khan's podcast, okay? Your issues with.
Yeah, sure. Well, I want to first say that I'm not an anti-monogamist or anything, and I know he wrote a very pro-monogamy book, and I think the second half of your interview with him, I learned a lot about the legal history of marriage in the United States. There's a lot of really interesting things in the second half that I didn't necessarily take issue with, but I think the way that he talked about monogamy from the biological point of view really, really got under my skin because, first of all, there's some things that are just not true that he said. Number one, he said that there are no hunter-gatherers that are not monogamous. I mean, that's absolutely not true. There are tons and tons of different mating systems among contemporary hunter-gatherer tribes, and even what we know of some uncontacted tribes. And we can talk about that in a second. But the biggest problem I had with the way he was talking about monogamy is he made no distinction between sexual monogamy or sexual fidelity and social monogamy or economic monogamy. And if there's anything that we've learned from animal behavior about studying monogamy is those are very different things. And they almost never really go together anyway. But when they do, of course, that's interesting. And people find that to be the parallel of human marriage, of course. But the vast majority of species that practice social monogamy, and what is social monogamy? Well, that's when two creatures pair up. And they have a neurohormone-derived attachment, and they are each other's main social partners. They will share territory. They share resources. It's usually for the purpose of raising children, but it's really a partnership. And it's and when you're talking about social monogamy, it's the bond itself that you're really interested in. Sexual monogamy or fidelity, it really is about exclusivity. So you would be only having sex with your social monogamous partner. That would meet the criteria of sexual monogamy. And that is extremely rare in nature. Not unheard of. There's a few examples of it. The example he gave is not correct, but there are some. And it's really interesting, of course, when that does happen. But the vast majority of socially monogamous species are not sexually monogamous. And that's really the problem that I saw in what he said. And so, for example, he talked about gibbons, and he said that gibbons are monogamous, but they cheat. Okay, that's a weird statement to me. So, first of all, cheating is moralizing it as if they've made some sort of vow that they're now breaking. I mean, come on, these are gibbons. Secondly, there's 20 species of gibbons, so I'm not sure which one he's talking about because they have different mating systems in there. I think something like 10% of gibbon groups have more than one adult as in their pairing. So obviously most of them do pair up, and gibbons have long been a model of monogamy. But again, social monogamy, sexual monogamy does not follow, not in gibbons, not in almost any other species. So that's really why I immediately wrote you, because I remember you and I, if you remember, Razib, we had an appointment for me to talk about my last book. This was several years ago, and for some reason it just didn't happen. I don't remember why. I think you got busy. And so when I went back to our Twitter messages, I realized we never actually completed that. So I was like, you know what? Let me just see if you'll be up for having a conversation about this. Just because I am reacting to something that was on your podcast.
Yeah.
For a while, if you want to ask any follow-ups, I mean, I have more to say, but
well, no, I mean, that's fair. I will say that, I mean, so Khan is very straightforward, in terms of he comes at it from an American conservative, social conservative viewpoint. And, that's who the book is marketed at, I enjoyed the book, but you're right. I think you're making a fair point. When I read your book, and I did read it yesterday, it does remind me of the way language is used differently in policy versus science. Okay. So in policy, I feel in policy and politics, it's like splitters versus lumpers.
Okay.
Okay. Which, like, in biology, like, splitters are like, okay, like, you have all these different classifications, whereas lumpers, like, put them in the same bucket.
Mhm.
And so when he says monogamy, I think he is actually, like, being politics focused. And, like, look, can you imagine, we support family values and social monogamy. Now, we understand that this is not absolute, it's just like, that's not how it's going to, like, it's like, we understand that this is going to be breached. Whereas in science, you want to describe all of the nuances of the phenomenon, because it's not prescriptive. It's descriptive.
Right. And the thing is, but I think that's the devil's in the details, Razib, because what social monogamy does for a species or for individuals is very different than what sexual fidelity does for them. And that's what I try to talk about a lot in the book is what motivates these behaviors. And therefore, and what I mean by motivation, I don't mean like internal motivation. I mean, what does the creature get out of it? So in social monogamy, it's not at all hard to imagine what these individuals get out of it, right? Because they are better off together than they would be apart. And of course, the real stars of monogamy are birds, because it really does take two or more, because somebody has to be incubating the eggs in order for them to develop properly. And you can't hunt, you can't eat, you can't do anything else if you're incubating eggs. So when you have two of them, they can take turns. And that's exactly what they do. 90% of migratory bird species are monogamous, but almost none of them are sexually exclusive in that monogamy.
Yeah.
They run off and they have extra pair copulations. And again, it seems like Khan would call that cheating. I mean, I don't know that there's deception going on, but there's certainly not promises made or whatever. It's just part of their behavior. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't conflict about that. Of course, they're going to try to reduce each other's extra pair copulations. And I talk in the book about some interesting things that birds do to try to restrict the others. For example, when a female, I forget the species now, but when they accept an extra pair copulation, they're very loud. They make these mating calls. And the purpose of them is to get their mated pair, their mated partner back. Say, come back here. Because they know, well, they don't know, but this is all instinctual, of course. But when he has extra pair copulations, he also will go and feed that secondary partner. And so that's what you see. Sometimes it's not just a squirt and go approach. These males will remember some of the people that they copulated with, and they'll try to feed them because, of course, they're now, their interests are linked, their genetics are intertwined. And so And it's all going on in the open, so I don't know that, deception and cheating is the right kind of language for that. But I think that Khan is mostly interested in mammals. And that's different because you have internal gestation. So the partnerships look very different between
Yeah.
humans and mammals.
I mean, I would say he's interested in mammals. He's interested in humans. He's interested in humans in complex societies.
Yeah.
I mean, and so that kind of colored everything else there.
Yeah.
There's a telos. There's a telos to the narrative, and I think that did probably affect how he framed other things.
Right. But I think, and that's the thing is, I don't want you to think that I'm anti-monogamy, and I certainly don't want you to think that I believe humans aren't built for monogamy. I think humans are built for lots of different possible mating systems and social arrangements, and that's and sex, who we have sex with versus who we form lifelong bonds with, are often the same, but they're not always the same. And I think when you survey hunter-gatherer tribes and contemporary ones, but also even cultures sort of before they had contact with the West, you saw a lot more diversity, even though we have, indistinguishable genetics in most cases. So I think what that tells us is that humans have an inherent flexibility when it comes to this, and we will conform to the cultural milieu that we're raised in. You absorb some of that stuff and it comes to mind. Now, so what's interesting about it to me, if you are interested in what's innate, is what is cross-cultural. Right. So things like jealousy certainly are cross-cultural. We do have a desire to restrict our mates' sexual activity. So that's normal. That's natural. That's not the same thing as saying we're built for monogamy. But I do think that the tendency for humans to form dyads is universal. I do think we have that tendency. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with polyamory. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with being promiscuous and not bonded. It just means that it's too common around the world, the forming of dyads, for that to be a coincidence.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack, and this can be I think I'm just gonna give a heads up. Sometimes I have long conversations on this podcast. I think it's gonna be a long one because we've got a lot of topics to cover, like on the science, but also it's just like in terms of the definitions and the lexicon. Like the term wrong. I mean, science doesn't really have a wrong. Science just is. Wrong emerges in the context of an ethical normative framework that we agree on as a culture. You're very clear about that. So, for example, you describe cultures where there's pedophilia, and then you bracket it out and you said, I'm describing this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that it's all like hunky dory, but you're describing it as a scientist. Right. You're not describing it as like Nathan Lents, who you like are having dinner with and has his own views on a variety of things, right?
Right. Yeah. And I am very careful to say that we don't have to model any of these things, and proliferate them if we don't want to. Obviously, there are some, and this is humans too, that have some societies that don't really, respect what, age of consent and things like this. And of course, I find it as abhorrent as anybody else. And in my inclusion,
not everybody else finds it abhorrent, especially
right. Yeah, that's true. Not everybody is, but I guess my point is not that any of that is natural or unnatural or desirable or undesirable. It's just these things happen. They're out there, and what it does tell us is that there's a diversity that's sort of natural, that will develop naturally in human inclinations, human behavior, the way that we form relationships. And I think that that's the strength of our species. And way, way, way at the end of the book, if you made it this far, Razib, and if anybody makes it to the end of my book, it'll be you. But way, way at the end, the thing I talk about is this is in keeping with other aspects of human biology and human psychology, in that we are the ultimate generalists. We really are. We don't just thrive in one environment or with one diet, one way of using our body. We really are. And that's why we are successful as we are, is that we're flexible and adaptable. And in order to be that, you have to have a sort of generic sense of some of these instincts that then only take shape in a cultural environment. So we have a cultural environment that has really pressed upon us sexual monogamy. And most people conform to that because of it. That's not bad exactly, but I do think it's optional. It could have turned out a different way.
Yeah. So I think one thing is, talking about evolutionary psychology, but there's also like the new field of cultural evolution. Mm-hmm. And I think cultural evolution is actually very relevant. And like we actually talk about cultural evolution with my podcast with Carl, with Joe Henrich. And I think with Kahn, he was focusing on kind of a particular portion of Henrik's oeuvre, of that project of looking at Western modern societies, whereas, what you're covering is a survey of all these different societies, and, you bring up things like that are well known that, okay, where does polyandry emerge? Well, it tends to be in these societies with resource scarcity and other things like that.
Right.
I also want to say, go back to the animals. Animals are not cheating, or it's not immoral. Like, what's going on here? I mean, part of it is we don't need to get totally Dawkinsian, but, like, genes exist. They exist in a behavioral context. And a lot of this is like, let's talk about game theory. Like, what is going on? Like, how are they optimizing within this context over this environmental, this period in the environment? And, this relates to part of some of the things that you were talking about with sexual reproduction, which I want to get to, where among like spiders and stuff, there are clonal lineages that reproduce really fast, and yet they all tend to be very young. Whereas the sexually reproducing species have like very, very deep phylogenies. And like the theory there is the clonal ones overfit to a local environment and they just go extinct. But they always like reemerge. They always just reemerge. And so like when you think about like the game theory, if you think about the genes that are looking over the long term want to be in these, I like want to. All these words are like really weird to use. But it's like this is how you have to think about it, where there's like this panoply of like scenarios, and there are different strategies crawling around and exploring the parameter space of the certain scenarios, right?
Right. Because asexual reproduction gives you a lot of short-term gains, but not long-term robustness, because you have to be robust in the face of a changing environment. If you overfit, as you say, to your particular local environment, that is not a good long-term strategy, right? Because the environment changes, you're screwed. If everyone lives and dies the same way, then you're really in trouble. So sexual reproduction ends up being favored in all the major lineages of eukaryotes because it makes you robust. Someone in your species will have the right combination of alleles to survive whatever the next cataclysm is. I mean, that's sort of the strategy. That's the game theory, if you will. But what I think is interesting is that when it comes to sex and gender and reproduction and mating and all of these things, we haven't thought about it that way, about how diversity in gender, diversity in sexuality, diversity in how you form relationships is another form of biological diversity that would tend to be favored over the long term over doubling down on one particular way of being. So I think it's fitting that biology is kind of we've understood that diversity is good and that sexual reproduction produces diversity and spreads diversity and unlinks all of the diversity. So why wouldn't sex itself follow those same rules? Like, I don't think that should really be that surprising. And I do think that the cultural bias against some of this stuff really prevented scientists from seeing it as it really was. You'll probably remember, my opening to the chapter on monogamy. I talk about how everyone thought birds were sexually monogamous. Everyone thought that. All of the ornithologists for 100 years, from Conrad Lorenz through everybody else. And then all it took was DNA evidence. And within a year, everyone realized, oh, holy crap, those eggs that they're roosting aren't necessarily the product of at least one member of the pair, and sometimes even two. I don't talk about brood parasitism in this book, but I have an article coming out about it, because that's another way that we're, it's not what you think. If you want a simplistic look, at what the animal world is, then you're really not going to capture it all.
Yeah, I mean, as I was, you're talking about social monogamy versus sexual monogamy. It depends on what your disciplinary lens is too. Like I tend to think things in terms of genetics, and so I think of terms like reproductive skew.
Yes,
and like the proportion of extra. So like if you say a species is monogamous and it turns out like, well, let's give a concrete example. We know that like Eurasian societies, it's a couple of percent extra pair paternity per generation. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's pretty monogamous, right?
Over what time frame are you talking?
Let's do 1,000 years, right?
Recently, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 1,000 years, right? So these are not small-scale societies. They're societies with patrilineages and et cetera, et cetera. You look at rare surnames and you look at which Y chromosomes are in there, and it's like you estimate like 1 to 2% introgression, whatever.
1-2%. So I thought I remembered it being a little bit higher than that prior to like blood testing in the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah, I think part of that's fair. It's gone down. I think it's gone down since then. Actually, I think this is like a higher
certainly
level.
now the DNA testing is available.
Yeah.
It's gone way down.
Well, how do I say this? Okay, this is not part of the. I heard from someone. I heard from a genetic counselor.
Uh-huh.
The people most likely to make extensive use of DNA testing are the people least likely to.
Okay. Okay.
So I don't know. Let's just say like the type of people that would engage in like more extra parent paternity issues, just like they don't keep track of but like a lot of people are like of like more professional managerial class are more paranoid about this stuff, right?
Yeah,
so a lot of the earlier estimates, as have ascertainment biases because they come out of paternity clinics, and even in those situations, most of the men who were suspicious were wrong.
Right,
but like
right.
like 20 or 10% of the time they were right, but that was like an enormous inflation,
right,
because
they had
it's
some
obviously
reason to
a
be
skewed
there in the
sample.
first place.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is, this is like, okay, I some of the listeners know this. I have a friend. Okay, the Arabs do a lot of Y chromosomal phylogenetic stuff. Okay,
Mhm.
they buy like extremely expensive kits, and they can like tell like cousin from cousin by like whatever, like 5 mutations and all these because like they really care about their paternal lineages. And I asked a friend of mine, this was 10 years ago, I was like, hey, are you worried that they're gonna find an extra pair, blah blah blah, and like someone's gonna get killed? I don't know, and he's like, actually no, because this never happened.
Really?
So there's social controls in the Arabian Peninsula, which okay. After he told me, I was like, yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
I see that. So some societies have extremely strong social controls because like everything is so dependent on these paternal lineages. And so, for example, the lineages of the Prophet Muhammad, a lot of these families, the Hashemites, the Moroccan royal family, they have the exact same Y chromosome as a branch of J1 haplogroup, right?
Right.
And so obviously, the Banu Hashem, like that family, they've been keeping track of this and all this stuff. In other cases, it's not true. There was like a case in China where, well, actually the Kong clan descended from Confucius, whatever his family. There's a bunch of them, and there was like a rumor that one of them weren't real Kongs, and that turned out to be true.
Okay.
Like it was a totally different Y chromosome, so someone passed himself off as a descendant of Confucius. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff like that. I always think about this when I hear about like anthropological descriptions or just these stylized descriptions. Well, they're polygamous or polygynous or they're polyandrous or they're monogamous. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, what's the distribution of genetic outcomes? And all of these terms that we're using, and I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot here. They're terms that are useful for us as human beings, but they don't really exist in nature as such. In nature, there's just behaviors.
Right.
Behaviors and reproduction and cooperation and conflict and these other things. But these like, iterative things that we classify as monogamy or polygamy, they're for us.
They're
right?
for us. And they don't have these sharp borders between these different categories that we like to think they do, right? They all kind of bleed together. You never have a society that perfectly fits anything with all members obeying the rules and all that kind of thing. And you mentioned social control. Social evolution is, as you said, a very hot area right now because the way that these things, and Darwin even just first predicted that, like we're kind of beyond where the biology really predicts who's going to succeed, right? It's really the social and psychological factors are far outweigh and cultural factors far outweigh biological factors in terms of who's reproducing. And if you look at just the United States, there are several presidents. It doesn't get more powerful than that, who have no descendants, no direct descendants, right? Abraham Lincoln, no direct descendants. George Washington, no direct descendants. But then you have Marine Duval, who I understand was somewhat influential in the 1600s. He probably has 2 million direct descendants, right? And Barack Obama's descended from him and Dick Cheney and everybody else. So you have these really uneven amounts of reproduction that come down mostly to chance, right? Largely to chance. Of course, it's a weighted die, a weighted pair of dice, but it's still mostly based on chance. And I think that plays out in the natural world as well. And so, of course, you stack the deck in features that will make it more successful. And What I think is most telling, though, is like I said, when you see cross-cultural things, or when you see things that pop up in species again and again. And menopause is a great example of that, because I did try to make a little list of some of the things I agree with Khan on, and Khan and you on some of this. And menopause is one of these things where among primates, although actually a former student of mine they're seeing signs of menopause in orangutan, so that's going to be interesting. But anyway, menopause was influential in creating the social, the family as we think of it, right? The invention of menopause. What does that do? Well, this is where I disagree with a lot of people. How they describe it is, why are women still alive when they can't reproduce anymore? That's totally backwards thinking, right? It's not that their lifespan has been extended. It's that their reproductive senescence happens earlier in their lifespan. So why does that happen? That happens on purpose, right? And the idea is that when you live in the kind of groups that humans lived in, after a certain point, just pumping out more children doesn't help long term, right? Because they're just going to compete with each other. So if you cease your reproduction, particularly when reproduction itself is risky, right? As in humans, it always is. So when you cease doing that and instead you invest in the next generation and the next generation after that, then your genes have a much greater chance of being successful than if they were all competing with each other. That's a good example of game theory. So, but I don't think that has anything to do with monogamy. And Khan was trying to connect menopause with monogamy, and the idea being only if you're certain of paternity would some of this stuff evolve. And I don't see that at all, especially when you consider that toothed whales are the other place we're seeing menopause. None of them are monogamous.
They're
right?
matrilineal.
They're matrilineal. They're polygynous or just promiscuous, most of them.
Sure.
There's no connection to monogamy there.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. So, I mean, I would say, I didn't jump in here, but I know that there, Virpi Luma in Finland and others have taught. There's an extensive literature, not just her. There's an extensive literature that what really matters is your matrilineal grandmother, actually, because. Well, I mean, there's just like a bunch of reasons. I mean, it could be some paternity certainty issue, but also the connection between mothers and daughters.
Reservoirs of cultural knowledge, right? I mean, I think that's
And I do have to say, like, when I was interested in this topic, we're talking about culture versus evolution, or like how they interact. So in the Indian subcontinent, like where my family's from in Bengal, it's a very patrilineal society officially, patrifocal officially, very patriarchal, right? Whereas like in the Meghalaya and the highlands, it's matrilineal. And so like, okay, these two cultures are like really different, but they were looking at grandmother effect and stuff like that. And like the anthropologists, like in this paper that I was reading, they actually were talking about how in the lowland Bengali society, it's like, oh, the paternal grandmother is supposed to matter a lot because, well, I mean, it's your father who creates your identity in your lineage group. But it turns out in a lot of times that's just breached and that's just like not adhered to. And I'm from a Bengali family. I can tell you that's just true a lot of the time. Maternal family just matters more, even though the cultural norm is actually reemphasizes over and over again. It's your paternal family that matters, but a lot of times that's just not true.
Right. And how they talk about it versus how it really isn't always the same thing, and that's why they have to enforce the idea that it's patrilineal.
They talk about it. They talk about it all the time because they're just like, just so your uncle, your maternal uncles are cool, but like, that's not your real family. Or, I mean, the words are a little different, but you know what I'm saying? The point here is, I think that there is, and like, in Indo-European mythology, there's this whole thing, there's a tension in these patrilineal, patriarchal societies where maternal uncles are somehow important. Yeah. It's like, just like the motif reoccurs over and over again. And I think that honestly is probably something deeply evolutionary between like the mother and her brothers who are going to have a strong interest in her survival and flourishing, no matter like whether they're exogamous, patrilocal, right?
Right. Well, that may be true. I think you were coming close to making the point I thought you were going to be making there was that really with civilized life, I shouldn't say civilized, sedentary life was when a lot of this came about. Right. And so the concentration, once you had resources that you could take with you, there was ownership of land, there's all those things that came from agriculture was when I think it started to emphasize patrilines, and it started to emphasize inheritance, all the idea when you could pass something on, when land could be dominated by a certain person, that's when you had strong men, right? And their idea, and of course, the evolutionary instinct to protect your lineage is always going to be there. But the idea that men could overpower women and control and dominate resources, that really only came about with sedentary life. And that's where, me, you, and Khan probably all agree. Because before that, everything we can tell from both archaeology and from contemporary foraging societies is that it is much more egalitarian, and that actually women have a lot of social control in those environments for various reasons. That doesn't mean that they're complete control, but they have a lot more social control than, for example, early agricultural societies. I do think it's kind of funny hearing you and Khan both speak romantically about the egalitarian things as conservatives. But anyway, you guys oppose any kind of political enforcement of egalitarianism, even though you understand its value and its benefits. But that's getting into politics, which we can do later. But I think that there's lots of other stuff that I think we agree on. Like you mentioned how a lot of leftists are down on marriage, and they talk about romantic love as having been a very recent innovation. It's by the poets, more than anything else. Totally disagree with that. I totally disagree with that. If you look at foraging societies, you see lots of individuals falling madly in love based on their sexual activity, right? So there's nothing unnatural about the idea that you become extremely attached to someone by having sex with them or wanting to have sex with them. And that's the romantic love that we talk about. And it's very idealized. It's often suspends other values that you have and things like that. That is universal. I do believe in that. So I think that, we have a lot, the right and the left on some of these issues have a lot more in common, and sort of the crazies on both sides, I think exacerbate the real divisions that most of us have, or probably we would circle around, a lot closer.
Or it could be kind of almost like a horseshoe theory thing,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that happens. Okay, I do want to say one thing, and then I want to move to sex, like in terms of a more abstract way, because that's where you start your book.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, you start your book as like kind of like evolutionary genetics, like what is sex, and then how does then it kind of like to me it's like, okay, this is like gender in animals, like that's kind of like, it was a little bit mind blowing, although it kind of made sense. Some of it is like semantic, like okay, like you want to whatever,
Mm-hmm.
like I knew a lot of these things. And then you kind of like worked through the animal kingdom, and then the primates, and eventually the humans, and some other things like homosexuality, gay identity, all that near the end, right? And so it's like
Mm-hmm.
it made sense. You covered a lot of topics here. I want to ask about sex, but first I do want to say one thing. Neanderthals, there could be. Neanderthals are like hundreds of thousands of years over like a huge span. So far, though, all of the DNA we have indicates that they are patrilineal in terms of within their groups. The Y chromosomes are the same; they're like related men, and the females tend to be unrelated. And Neanderthal culture, I don't know, it's not as variable.
That also could be female dispersal, right? So when you're gonna have
That might not be the correct term. Like a patrifocal maybe would be
okay.
that would be what I would be saying there.
Because how many Neanderthal Y chromosomes do we really have? Like 20, 30?
No, I think it's actually considerably more than that.
Is it? Okay.
In terms of like, not whole genomes. You know what I'm saying?
Because I study whole genomes, and I know it's not that many, but Y
I would
chromosomes
say dozens. I would say dozens, but not like hundreds, dozens.
Yeah. But I do see your point that if it does tell us something, I think, when you have clusters of, for example, Y chromosomes, but that can be explained a lot of different ways, particularly if you have only a small subset of the original data. And I think that female dispersal doesn't necessarily mean male dominance, but it can. And there's every reason to think that physical strength was super, super important in Neanderthal life. So that's the kind of thing that would favor, the higher testosterone individuals, right? Because of the muscle mass that you get. So, that what does that tell us about us? Well, if that were also true of our ancestors that began to settle down, that also explains why patriarchy took hold pretty much everywhere that agrarian societies took hold, right? It is that they were patriarchal, probably because that physical strength was important for the earliest seeds of power, and the social control that women had was lost, once resources became part of it. I mean, this is hand waving a little bit, but this is what some of the theorizing is.
Yeah, and like, just like the discussion we have about these things is kind of exposes like the skeleton or kind of like the understructure of our assumptions and the terms that we're using here. And so I
Right.
want to move that like back to kind of like the atomic unit of like sex. Okay, so I'm not like, look, how do I explain this? I mean, there's a joke, as you know, Nathan, like geneticists don't know like real biology. Um, what I'm trying to say? Like, I kind of like do population genetics stuff here, and like I know what sex is. Like, I've read W.D. Hamilton. I love his books actually. The Evolution of Sex, like the one of those. I think it was like the second volume. It was the second volume. Anyway, I love this stuff. But in terms of definitions, honestly, it's just like it's kind of take it for granted. But then, you get into like gametes and, the anatomy and all these other things. And the thing that's always like blown my mind is that there are males. I mean, even when I was a little kid, there's male and female organs in plants. I wouldn't have been like shocked if there was like male and female in mammals, and then everything else was totally different. You bring up hermaphrodites, which like really well known from annelids, but they're in other organisms, and those of us that have worked with elegans know that they're hermaphrodites, and then there's like a male minority.
Yeah. And what's
There's
interesting is
diversity that you go over. Can you just like survey it for the listener?
right. So making eggs, making sperm, does set up some differences, right? Is some different reproductive goals with that initial investment. But I think that has been way overblown. In a lot of creatures, the different reproductive interests in male and females are not that big until you get to mammals. In birds, it's more than in other creatures, but in fish and various reptiles and everything else, the reproductive investment of sperm with eggs is such a minuscule difference that I think it's been really
the fish makes sense. The fish makes sense. Can you like explain that, like gamete size and like like the resources and all that stuff? And also, there's the gestation in mammals, or whatever.
Right. So with fish, we'll take it. It's always external fertilization, right? So both sexes just simply squirt their gametes and go. There's no external genitalia. There's no sexual intercourse. They squirt and go, both of them. And so because of that, you don't see a large difference in their reproductive interests. And so you'll have, for example, in sunfish, I spend a lot of pages talking about sunfish. The males do all of the nest building. They spend 2 weeks in North American sunfish building a nest, and then another 2 weeks guarding the eggs of that nest. The females show up, squirt their eggs, and go. That's literally it. They're the deadbeat mothers of the animal kingdom. But that just goes to show you that when you are just doing that external fertilization, everything we think of in terms of maternal and paternal investment doesn't apply. And so you don't tend to see the differences that you see between males and females in birds and then again in mammals. And so I talk a lot about fish and how sex just doesn't operate the same way. And when you do have animals that can switch genders or switch sexes, I should say, they do that in response to changes in the environment that once again make it more suited for that particular ecology. And we think about the environment just as like abiotic features, climate or temperature, whatever. But there's biotic elements about the environment. Everything could be fine, and then the animal you like to eat is suddenly gone, right? And so it doesn't really look any different. It doesn't feel any different, but the thing you've been eating is gone. So think about that also in the social environment. So if you're living in groups of 40 or 50, and then suddenly you get to a nice open grassland with lots of food, and all of a sudden you're in a group of 20 or 30, that's a very different social environment. And so the calculation of what works best in the sort of reproductive conflict that we're all in, that will be different. And then those groups compete against other groups. I mean, I know you and David Sloan Wilson have, do a lot of stuff together, and he's really big on modeling groups in competition with one another, and how that actually promotes cooperation. And it's funny because competition and cooperation are often presented to us as opposites. But if you think about the cognitive skills that are required to compete against someone, they're the exact same as the cognitive skills required to cooperate with them, right? Cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, understanding someone else's point of view, and all of that kind of thing is part of how we work together and how we compete. And why do I tell that example? What does that have to do with sex? Well, it just shows you that the same set of features can be switched from a totally different goal. Even though with no real changes in cognitive ability or anatomy or anything like that, you can completely switch what a certain trait is used for. And so I think that same kind of diversity is present in sex and in gendered behaviors. And I use the term gender with animals, where a lot of biologists would never do that. And I know I'm out on a limb a little bit with that. But all I mean by that is that there's different ways to be a male. There's different ways to be a female that can find success. And sometimes being minority is itself an advantage, right? That's called frequency dependent selection among you geneticists, and the oddball hypothesis. That's what promotes diversity and maintains it in an environment.
Yeah, there's something actually I want to bring up before we get back into the brass tacks of chromosomes and all these other things, which I think I want to talk about because I love chromosomes. But years ago, I don't even remember the details. But okay, okay, so it was like Jordan B. Peterson was talking about lobsters and monogamy and all this stuff. And I thought it was kind of silly, honestly. It was like naturalistic fallacy type stuff. I think, you go into the book, and that's basically like for the listener, it's basically like it's in nature, therefore it's good.
I think it was about dominance, right? About how lobsters that are more dominant will have more serotonin, which is like in the reward system. And so, if they lose fights, they get depressed and go away. And if they win fights, they're happy and succeed. And he uses this as a defense of social stratification in humans, which I think is really, really big leap.
Yeah. Well, my main issue I would say is like, if you're going to do that, like you got to get phylogenetically close. But anyway,
yeah, exactly.
I imply that in the book because you're an evolutionary guy, and like that's the way you got to think. You got to think phylogenetically. But I do have to say, I remember being kind of annoyed by a lot of scientists making fun of him because part of it was like in group, out group stuff. It was kind of silly, but candidly, these are the same people that are like talk about like gender stuff and transitions. They're like, well, the fish and the temperature. And I'm just like, why are you bringing up fish and the temperature?
Right.
What does that? What does that have to do? And so I think people can be very, very selective when it's like, oh, well, that's a naturalistic fallacy.
Okay. Yeah, no. You make a good point because both sides will cherry pick the examples that they think makes their point. So what I try to do, like for example, let me briefly defend Jordan Peterson's example, not the example itself, but what he's trying to show is that he tries to get a little bit mechanistic with it, right? He talks about serotonin and he talks about what dominance would do for the lobster compared to other lobsters, and then using that as a model for human behavior. So I don't have any problem with that. The fact that we're very distantly related, that's not the problem because some of the features of it are the same. And that's okay. Whether or not his example is relevant to humans or not isn't my point. And I do that in the book too, not as to say, hey, let's look at how Barbary macaques live. They're really the best model for humans. That's not really what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to say, what do Barbary macaques do and how is that good for them? Like, how does it promote their flourishing? For example, Kahn really liked to use gibbons as an example of monogamy. And then I think he mentioned tamarins, which that can't be right because most tamarins are actually polyandrous. They're not monogamous at all. But there is a South American primate called the coppery titi, which is both sexually and socially monogamous. So it's one of like 6 or 7 mammals that we found. And I think it is really interesting to study coppery titis, even though we're not closely related. They're New World monkeys, right? So they're pretty far away. But they have some things in common with us that if we study how they approach it, then we actually can learn a little bit about ourselves. One thing that they have is female choice is very dominant in coppery titis, and they have a complete division of labor, so high paternal investment. And that's another thing that's kind of peculiar about humans. We have high paternal investments. Fathers care about their children and they want to support them and all of that, whereas in lots of mammals, they just don't care at all, right? Or if they do, it's very indirect. But the problem is the other species where you see high paternal investment aren't like copperies. So I talk about Barbary macaques, the Northern African macaques. They have the opposite. They're completely promiscuous. There's no bonding whatever among sexual partners. They do have social bonding, of course, but not among sexual partners. And they have alloparenting, cooperative alloparenting, almost unheard of in mammals, where they will parent each other's children, happily. And you also see a lot of same-sex dyads that form in these creatures because they just don't care who's genetically related to who, right? And so to me, that's a closer model to humans. Why is that? Of course, we do care about our genetic offspring, but we also drop our kids off at daycare and somebody else educates them. Somebody else cares for them when they're sick. They go to the hospital. So to me, cooperative alloparenting is a closer model to what humans actually do. We do take care of each other's children. Of course, we prefer our own, when we have to choose, but you will care for your friend's kids, sometimes even at great personal cost. And I think that's Barbary macaques. They do, because if you want to look at Cooperatetes as a model of humans, those groups live in pure isolation. You have a nuclear family in no contact with any others. They're territorial. So to me, the analogy breaks down when you see a family just in isolation like that. We live in community. It's very much part of who we are.
Yeah. Again, I'm gonna push you back to the chromosomes and the evolution of sex, but this is like
we're
out of control here. But I'm just gonna let it. I'm just let's just go with it, right?
Yeah.
I think I think it's very interesting because I do agree with you in terms of human social organization, social complexity, and our cooperation, all these things. I mean, they're pretty amazing, and I think candidly, scientists that have been trying to figure out what's like simple inclusive fitness or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
it just doesn't work. And so it's got to be more than inclusive fitness. I'm not saying it's just inclusive fitness or reciprocal altruism, but there's all these things, and we have these. We're both citizens of the United States. So 350 million people, You live in a city of you live in a city of millions. And there are some antisocial people, but generally you're pretty safe,
Yeah.
There's just all these miraculous goings on. And you mentioned it in the book where it's if a chimpanzee stranger and a common chimpanzee stranger shows up, they'll kill it and eat it or something,
Yeah.
Whereas,
if you're from a different troop, you're a mortal enemy.
Yeah.
Actually, have you talked to Mark Moffat? Have you had him on your show?
I haven't, so I have his book, Human Swarm, right?
It's excellent. It is
Yeah,
excellent.
I actually I was supposed to have him on the Insight previous podcast, and the pandemic happened.
Okay.
And so that just the Insight kind of ended.
I can connect you to him. He's a friend of mine. If I can connect you to if you want, because Mark talks about this a lot, that humans really we define our group with these symbols and identifiers. And it really comes down to predictability. So if you see someone who looks like you, dresses like you, speaks your language, then you can predict their behaviors relatively quickly. But someone who's very foreign to you is unpredictable. That's kind of how he would put it. And so we form these nested groups, basically. So we have, our small group, our large group within larger groups. And that nested social relationships, if you look at other animals, that's really a good model of human sociality. And of course, he's most interested in ants, as you know. He's E.O. Wilson student.
Yeah, I mean,
very much in on the ants. But they have that same thing. Remember, he gives this example of if you take an ant from a different species, but right across the street, and then you put it into that group, they'll attack it and kill it. But you can move an ant from San Francisco down to San Diego, and if it's part of the same society in that species, they will immediately accept it because they recognize each other with these hydrocarbons, these aromatic hydrocarbons. And that's what humans do, right? So if you're in an airport, in Sri Lanka, and you recognize someone from your town, country, whatever, you will immediately go over to them and start interacting with them socially, right? And that sense of familiarity, we don't use aromatic hydrocarbons, right? But we use things like language or clothing or whatever. And so this is kind of getting a little bit further away from the topic of my book, but you mentioned that societies and how they form. Really, you should have Mark Moffat on your show. It's a great conversation.
Yeah, I mean, this is we're just gonna Mark's gonna come on, and then someone's gonna respond to him, and this is just a never-ending daisy chain of conversations.
Yeah.
One thing
that's how it's supposed to work. That's social evolution.
I think I mentioned this before. I mean, I don't know which book I read it in, but you're talking about someone sees someone else from Sri Lanka. Well, the weirdest example that I ever remember about this was in a book, and it was a white guy. He was a professor or something, but he was from the South. He had a Southern accent, and he was in Japan on some work trip, and he was walking down the street in Tokyo. This is the 1970s, so not that many foreigners, now many more in Tokyo now. And he was walking down the street and sees a guy with an afro like running at him. And he's like, okay, what's going on here? The guy's like, hey, I'm from America. I'm from America. It's a black guy. And like, he's like, hey, how are you doing? And, like, the guy's got a Southern accent. And, apparently, like, I remember, like, the guy who with the Southern accent was a little self-conscious. He's like, I don't want him to, it's the 1970s. I don't want him to think that I'm racist.
Mhm.
But, like, the black guy was just, like, super happy to see him.
Right.
Was like, where are you from? And, like, like, how are you doing? And, like, how long have you been in Tokyo? The whole point here was like, okay, like it's a black guy. He meets this white Southern guy. The guy is obviously Southern from his accent, but the black guy is just super excited to meet another American.
Another American. But you know what's funny? In the opposite direction, I don't know that the white guy's running up to the black guy to say, hey, right?
Maybe
Right?
not. In that case, that was not what happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just interesting how, like, all of a sudden you realize the similarities you might have with someone in your own culture where there is narcissism of small differences.
Right. Well,
Okay.
that brings us back to Darwin. I think it was Darwin that first said that too, is that when two groups collide, the biological difference between them is irrelevant. It's the cultural difference between them that determines the outcome of that collision,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll loop back to this, but things like tattoos and accents, shibboleths, shibboleths. I mean, and with humans in particular, the cultural differences become very salient.
Yeah.
I want to go back to sexual evolution. We kind of already alluded to it. Talk about asexuality, diploidy, or the polyploidy, whatever, ploidy in general. And then also just like talk about sex. Why it's around, and actually, like, you kind of alluded to it, but I used to read in this literature, and like, there's the whole like Red Queen, like pathogen coevolution stuff going on. Other people said, oh, it's just like some structural lock-in and all these other things. And I would like you to just like give me a general sense of where the origins of sexual reproduction are like in the mid 2020s, because I honestly haven't paid attention in 15 years because that's how science is. You specialize. Like that, like give the listener like a general survey.
Well, we start at the most basic level. Like asexual reproduction, is just cloning, copying, right? Which is very fast, very efficient. Energy usage is low. There's no risk. It's great, very prolific, but it doesn't create any diversity or any resiliency. And it also, you can tend to accumulate what's called negative deleterious mutations in that setting. But sexual reproduction comes about as a way of combining and mixing genetic material for the new generation. So that's great because you can unlink traits. So if someone's tall and fast versus tall and slow or whatever, like the different traits all get unlinked. So that's one aspect of sexuality that's important, or sexual reproduction. But even more fundamental is, as you mentioned, diploidy. So humans and all other sexually reproducing creatures have two versions of every gene, two versions of every chromosome. Whereas if bacteria and other asexual reproducers have only one. And why that's important is when you have two copies of something, first of all, you have a template if one of them gets damaged, right? So by DNA, radiation, DNA damage, single strand break, double strand break, whatever, you can use the other chromosome as a copy and then as a template to copy and then fix.
Really quick, I'm going to pause. Like, just in genetics, example people give of like where this isn't working is retinoblastoma, where people have only a single working copy, and so these kids, they can see fine, but then their teens and young adulthood, they start like fading because a lot of their like they don't have any redundancy and they're starting to like get mutations, right? And so
that's right, because one copy is already damaged, so it can't serve as a template to fix the other one. And we are bombarded by DNA damaging agents. No matter what you do, you're gonna experience mutations, and having that backup copy gives you a way to fix it. That's advantage number one. But the advantage number two is even more profound. And it also allows you to play around with one version. And maybe some of these mutations that come about are beneficial, right? It's rare. Most mutations are obviously going to be harmful because it's like a lightning strike. It very rarely does a lightning strike build a house. It usually tears the house down. But every once in a while, you can get a mutation that's good. And so by having a backup copy, it allows you more flexibility to play around. And that alternate copy that you might have maybe has no advantage for you right now, but down the road it could. So what it allows you to do by having 2 copies and sexual reproduction, you need both of these to work. But when you do that, you create a diverse gene pool. So that's the other thing, is don't think about just a single individual. You have to think about a populations of hundreds of individuals over hundreds of generations. They're going to circulate all these alleles, and they're going to be moving in and out of all, the different organisms and separate from one another. That's another key thing, is that, the alleles don't necessarily end up in the same person. And so each one can be selected for its own merit. And therefore, as a population, it gradually gets rid of bad alleles and accumulates good alleles, and then new ones pop in and they get circulated. That's really only possible in a sexually reproducing species. And so that's why plants, animals, fungi, and even the larger protists, seaweed, things like this, they've all gone in the sexual direction, because it has such long-term advantages over the short-term advantages of asexual. But that is a value judgment, right? Because we think of humans as more successful than E. coli, which is, a bacteria that lives in our gut. But they outnumber us even in our own body, right? There's at least twice as many bacterial cells in your gut as there are human cells in your whole body. So it's really hard to say that we're better than them, considering, they've done pretty well going the other direction, which is streamlining. So to me, that's almost the point, right? Is that there's many different ways to succeed. And one of them is diversity.
Yeah, so and then you have like male and female. We already kind of like talked about this. I think I think your take is, in general, like, we're kind of like mammal centric, emphasizing these gamete size differences and like the different behavior of male and females. I mean, I actually like point well taken. Like, I know that male and female, like, there's dimorphism, sexual dimorphism, right, what you're alluding to, but there's a lot of species where it's like not the way that we're expecting,
yes,
or there's that much dimorphism,
right.
And so, like, whatever. And like,
dimorphism is interesting because I think it's both been overinterpreted and underappreciated. What I mean by that is, so for example, it's why we didn't realize that from a third to a fourth of albatross pairings are same sex, because albatrosses look the same. All females and male, you can't tell them apart. Even a really experienced ornithologist can't tell them apart because they don't have external genitals, right? And we didn't realize that a lot of the pairings that we saw were actually 2 females. So because they have no dimorphism. And then in mammals, people interpret dimorphism as telling you something about monogamy. And it can in certain circumstances. Like, for example, gorillas have huge dimorphism. The males are about twice as big as the females. And that's because the males compete with each other and then dominate a smaller group of females. And by the way, that's not in all gorilla groups, but that's one way. That's the sort of the dominant way. And then if you look at chimpanzees, it's much more close to the same size, although they do have some dimorphism. Humans, you can't really tell because we're only about 15% bigger, the males versus the females. So we're closer to being sort of the same size. And so a lot of people have said, oh, well, that's a sign of monogamy. Monogamy is what happens when two sexes of the same size is a sign of monogamy. Well, that's not true for bonobos, which have less dimorphism than almost any primate. And they're completely promiscuous. They don't do pair modding at all. So the monogamy doesn't work with dimorphism with our closest relatives, but also we're dimorphic in other ways that many creatures aren't. So for example, the most obvious feature that humans have is our face, right? We're really attuned to faces. And that's also the hairiest part of a man and the hairless part of a woman, right? So we are extremely dimorphic when it comes to our facial presentation. So to say that we're not a dimorphic species is really odd, considering the thing that we concentrate most on is the most dimorphic. So I don't think you can read too much into that in terms of monogamy myself.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, that was fascinating. And so you also talked about the heterogametic sex. And so, a lot of people think of XY chromosomes, but, chicken, in chicken, the female is the heterogametic sex. And some different patterns there. And we don't need to like dig too much into detail, but in terms of chromosome evolution and sex determination, there's just a lot of ways you could do this.
A lot of ways.
Is subject to sexual. They're not sexual. It is subject to evolution.
Right.
Like sex chromosomes change. They disappear and they get reinvented.
Right. We've talked about a shrinking Y chromosome in the human lineage. But that doesn't mean that males are going away, or you see these weird articles that people interpret that.
Steve Jones. Yeah.
What's that?
Sorry, Steve Jones.
Yeah. It doesn't mean that males are going anywhere, and but it is interesting because you do see that, right, where new forms of sexual determination will emerge, and the ones that are the environmentally sensitive are the most interesting because that does give them a way to respond to environmental needs. And I talked about that in the book. Is there's a species of eel that is purely based on population density. So at very low density, they favor females, and then very high density, they favor males. And that's because males can then compete with each other and try to sort of improve the gene pool over time, whereas females are the productive sex, right? The ones that, that you need lots of eggs for. And so, by switching back and forth, but based on population density, again, you're more robust and it becomes more efficient. It's sort of akin to menopause in the way that it's a realization that just simply producing more children isn't always the best way to succeed for your own genetic stock, particularly in humans where we have very long gestation times and we have very long interbirth intervals. We really plan. Our life history is to plan for every child to succeed. Like that's really the goal. Whereas, fish will squirt 500,000 eggs. And if one or two make it, then they're doing fine. And that investment that we have.
Evolutionary ecologists call that R and K selected.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
so R selected would be R selected is if you have fewer offspring and you really invest in them, and K selection is if you have like an oak tree dropping acorns every year. They don't really invest anything except for that one shot. But both can succeed. There's many oak trees in the world, right? And both ways can succeed. I think it's pretty clear that humans are selected though, because we stop nursing fairly early compared to what our ancestors did. If women nursed longer, the birth interval would be closer to 4 or 5 years. Women aren't going to be having 20 kids in a hunter-gatherer society just because they nurse them for a lot longer. You don't ovulate, at least not as often when you're nursing. And you see that with the other apes as well, that you can predict their interbirth interval based on how long they nurse, because there's a pretty good correlation there.
No, that's
and there's a movement. This is on the left, but there's a movement to nurse kids a lot longer than the previous generation did. To nurse them for 4, 5, and 6 years. That would reduce fertility, which I don't know if that's the reasoning, but there's really good arguments that's what our ancestors did.
Yeah, I mean, I know, with my 3 kids, after they stopped breastfeeding, the other one showed up. So
yeah, exactly. That's how it works. And remember, if you stop breastfeeding for 4 or 5 days, then you can't anymore after that, right? So it switches off. With the idea being, it's time to either this one's died or moved on. It's time to create another one. I mean, we're romanticizing this and putting more intentionality than is really there, especially when you consider the variability that we see among women and among societies. But that's the point. To me, it's always been the point. The variability, the variation, it's a feature, not a bug of our species to be able to thrive in all of these different ways. I mean, we are the only species that, certainly among mammals, but I think probably the only vertebrate that can live in the desert and the rainforest and the tundra, temperate rainforest, tropical rainforest, seafaring people. There are societies that live almost exclusively at sea, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's those in the desert, and you can thrive either way. So, there's no animal that really accomplishes that the way that we do. And I think that's really telling, because what it talks about is we're not built to do any one thing or live any one kind of way. We're the ultimate generalists. We're omnivores, both metaphorically and literally. And there are species that can run faster, that jump higher, throw better, but we can run and jump and swim and throw. We can do it all. And then you use, whatever based on your environment. And I when you apply that same thinking to gender diversity, for example, and sexuality and sexual attraction, and even mating systems, you apply that same logic there, then you would expect to see a whole bunch of diversity in different times and places. So I think that's what's happening now. As you see young people, especially, really exploring these different things, it reflects the fact that we've removed a lot of social control on that, and that natural diversity is allowed to flourish. And so I would really hesitate, to try to clamp back down on it. I don't know what we want to gain by doing that. But that doesn't mean that we're not built for monogamy or dyads. It doesn't mean that. It just means we can thrive lots of different ways.
Okay. We're gonna get to that, and like we got to talk about homosexuality and stuff, and
Please.
gay and trans. So I think I'm gonna skip. I have some notes about hyenas, and like I always the hyena stuff is cool. There's like the sneaky fuckers.
Yeah.
Different morphs. I mean, there's so many topics in this book. Partly it's just like, okay, like I am like a biological sciences person, so there was a lot here, and I kind of got a little greedy with my topic list. So like at this point, I think like I'm gonna okay, like let's just like move. So sex and gender, and we talked about sex. These terms, this is something where the idea of gender came out of the idea of gender as a separate thing from sex came out of academia relatively recently within the last generation, but it's actually like very, very intelligible because on some level it's just defining what we already know. In terms of there are people, if I was like Judith Butler, I would say they perform, but whatever, we know what they mean. It's like you present in a certain way that conforms to the expectation of what your sex is. And there are some people that are at variance with this. And we all know there are like, third sexes, quote unquote, in a lot of societies. We're just scrambling our words here to define cultural, biosocial phenomenon. I'm going to use that word, right?
Yeah.
So like there's the way I think that people normally talk about it is there's two dimensions. So there is biological variation of sex where it's our anatomy. Yes. There are intersex people, a very small number, but they are intersex.
Yes.
Like they have a mixture, kind of like not a chimera, but just like whatever.
Yes.
Like I have like internal testes, present as female on the outside, etc. Whatever. There's like a lot of different small number there. And then there's the gender aspect where it's I don't know, when Achilles was dressed like a maiden because his mother did not want him to go to fight in battle. But I think Odysseus like had a bunch of like jewelry and then he had a sword in there and Achilles ran for the sword. He's like, oh, I gotcha. So he might have looked like a female because he's very beautiful, but he still behaved going for the sword, right? So the point there is obviously there's different performances, whatever. That's how we understand it. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you go into a lot more detail with animals,
right,
and everything like that. Like I feel like let's just say like I'm gonna say the humanities, like gender theory type is more almost like top down, whereas like you're starting from bottom up biologically in terms of how this does that make sense? And
I think that's exactly right, because it begins with a sexed body, right? So sex refers to bodies, right? It's a physical property of bodies, right? And gender is a psychosocial phenomenon. So it's the way that you interact with other people. It'd be very hard to imagine gender if someone's living alone on an island, right? But they're going to have a sex, but gender really is how you relate to other people. And it often aligns with sex, but it doesn't purely align with sex, and there's variation. And the point is that the variation that appears is often, another way to find success potentially or not. And the variation that we see in animals, for example, often comes about as a reproductive strategy that finds success. So we talk about sneakers are those males that, they're not going to bother trying to fight with the other males, but they're going to try to sneak up on the females, so to speak. And, the females don't always resist them, right? And the logic there is, well, that's a successful strategy, and my children will inherit that, and then they'll have a successful strategy. So it only works until, it becomes a majority, and then it would swing back the other way. But those kind of cycles of variation, the appearance of variation, the selection for it, I think is part and parcel to that. And then with human gender, as you mentioned, like, it emerged in academia, but actually it goes way beyond that, right? The word gender referred to language, right? It was declensions that you have in certain languages where you have masculine and feminine pronoun. Well, in English, it's really just like pronouns that get declensions, gender declensions. But in lots of other languages, nouns have gender. And to me, I like that in the sense that it shows that there's nothing sexual about a chair, right? But a chair can have gender. And so it's another property. It's separate from the physical aspect. It's more of a hard to define sort of, essence or something like that. And I think that's closer to what we mean by gender, is that it's the way you live in your sexed body, but among other people and their sexed bodies, and how you behave. So I think gender is a behavior. It is a performance but I don't mean it as it's inauthentic. It's just how you live. And so, of course, hair, makeup, clothing, that's going to be different from society to society, but feminine means something in all societies. Masculine means something in all societies. And so playing around with the feminine, playing around with the masculine, regardless of your sex, that's what I mean when I say gender diversity. And that's what we see in other animals. They play around with that a little bit. And sometimes they call it female mimicry, where you have a male who sort of pretends to be a female in some way. I critique some of those examples. I don't think that's mimicry is really what's going on. It's more of signaling, but we can talk about that. That's kind of technical. But in other cases, it almost certainly is mimicry. So I talked about the garter snakes where, garter snakes hibernate. So when they come out of hibernation after winter, they're very sluggish, right? It's very cold and slow, and they're exothermic, right? So they have to get their body heat from the environment. They don't generate it themselves. Well, one thing that they do is they, swarm around with other snakes and they kind of warm each other up. Well, there, of course, some variants have existed where the males will put out female pheromones. And what does that do? It makes all the other males mob them, and they're going to try to mate with them at the beginning of the breeding season. Well, they're not going to successfully mate. What they're going to do, though, is pass their body heat. So by mimicking a female, a garter snake can steal body heat from the others and then warm himself up faster. And by the way, he's tired the other guys out. So and then he's now warm, ready to go find those females, and he's tired out his competition. So that's an example where gender diversity has an advantage, right? It's not just a runt. It's not just some submissive male. He's got a leg up on the other males by pretending to be a female, right? So that's a classic example. I'm not the first one to write about that, obviously. But I give other examples in the book where actually doing that, acting in sex atypical ways, gives you an edge. And so why wouldn't nature play around with that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think one issue here is, if you read the Bible or whatever, just human constructs and constructions, we carve nature at its joints in very, very simple, stark, often dichotomous ways. But nature occupies distributions, various sorts of a Poisson distribution, a Gaussian distribution, like, you know what I'm talking about.
Bimodal distribution.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but the bimodal distribution, like we call the binary sex, issue, which is like a huge argument that's happening here. Honestly, as I'm reading as I was reading this, I was like, I can see this argument. And I think a lot of the issues here happen to be how we choose to define the limit of the distribution and how we want to I just feel like
I agree.
Me and you could actually let's just say look at the distribution of sex definition by some sorts of anatomical criteria. Let's just do it that way, okay? Ignore the chromosome stuff. And we would actually create a histogram, and we would both be like, okay, we agree on the histogram, you know?
Yeah.
But that could be a whole argument well, is there two sexes? Is there three sexes? How do we define this? Is it actually three sexes, but we have to start with two sexes? And a lot of this just has to do outside of the scientific domain with the policy stuff.
Exactly.
Right?
That's what I was saying is what you just described is this distribution that we see. That's what nature is. We need labels and words, and we call, okay, this is our cutoff for a male. This is our cutoff for a female. And we can ignore the ones in between. And, for 95% of us, that's probably going to be okay. But the point is, first of all, the people in the middle exist and they deserve dignity and rights and everything else. They're only guilty of being different. That's one thing. But secondly, the fact that they're different and that there is a variance speaks to nature's love of diversity. And what I mean by nature's love of diversity is mutations are always happening. Developmental programs are plastic. And things are designed to be what we call stochastic, where even if you rewind the tape on your own embryonic development and then replay it, you will not come out exactly the same way. There's just some chance that's at play. And that's by design. Again, that's a feature, not a bug, because the less we're all a monolith, the more robust the species is, right? And the thing is, biologists get that. In almost every other way except sex and gender, biologists get that. They accept that. They understand that variation is natural. It's going to happen. It's generally good. And then, selection can either trim off the extremes and reduce the diversity, or it can destabilize, right? So that's selection. But the emergence of the diversity is natural. It's just the way nature is. And so I hope, even if we can disagree about what's good for the society, I hope we can at least agree that the appearance of people who are transgender or intersex or whatever is a natural phenomenon. They deserve dignity. They should be allowed to thrive. And, and people get really, really angry and upset at their very existence, or they think that they're faking and they're making it up. Well, I don't know why someone would make up gender dysphoria when you consider there's no better way to get picked on in the schoolyard, or getting ostracized from your family and all of this. Like, come on, they're not making this up.
We could talk about gender dysphoria, but let me talk about intersex, actually, because that's a little bit more concrete. I think. I think it was 1999, long ago. I read some early Alice Dreger, and she actually wrote a fair amount about intersex. And this is this is back when they were still modifying intersex individuals as infants to usually make them look female. Like if they had a small penis, they would cut it off, And Alice was not a fan of this. She described it, but she expressed her opinion. And as I was reading it, I was like, we need to talk about this, because I'm not sure. I mean, honestly, how I felt about it was okay, this is kind of fucked up. Being intersex, you're a minority. Okay, you're a biological minority. It's like being achondroplasiac. Okay, I'm not gonna get into it, but there's some struggles with that. Whatever. And but I mean, what, you're gonna take this infant? I don't want to describe it, but you know what I'm trying to say here.
And that's what's happened for a long, long time. And that's even just the surgical intervention. Socially, the social abandonment and the malignment. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen to people whose difference, particularly in the genital anatomy, isn't what's expected. Now, the thing is the vast majority of intersex individuals are healthy. The vast majority of them are fertile, sometimes with medical assistance, sometimes not. And the vast majority of them do not seek surgical correction. Some do. And generally, you get surgical correction when you're really kind of close to one hump or the other of the distribution.
You kind of push it over.
Yeah, just push it over the other way, particularly if you have an identification with that. And if there's a chromosomal sex and there's all that, they are going to align more often than they're not. And so that might be what happens. But increasingly, as intersex individuals have found each other, and formed communities of solidarity, there's way less intervention going on to say that, look, you can live a happy life, a normal life. You can even find, a mate who's not also intersex, who might not care about your genital anatomy or even be attracted to it. And there's nothing wrong with that either, right? So as long as people are allowed to thrive and so forth. And one thing that's interesting is that intersex people have always had an easier time convincing people that they shouldn't be cast aside or discarded or whatever more recently than transgender people have. Because transgender people, it's often thought that this is optional. This is a choice that you're making and we can talk you out of it. But if it's a bodily variation, we seem to be more accepting of the fact that it was inevitable and they couldn't. Yeah.
It's concrete. I mean, we're talking I mean, one thing that I'm going to say here, though, is we're talking both of us, we live in America. It's a liberal democratic society. We have a range of viewpoints about, the terms like bodily autonomy or individual liberty, and just kind of the ability to flourish as who you are. And, that's informing our agreements here. Let's just put it that way. This is a normative expression of two individuals who are from the same culture. Talking about something that is descriptively, materially in the world out there. If we were from a different culture, frankly, if we were living 50 years earlier, we don't know, right? I want to put that out there and be really clear. And I think separating these sorts of things are important. I think you do a good job in the book because you do the asides, where you bracket yourself out of it and say, look, I'm describing how the Greeks were.
Yeah.
I'm not condoning it, but also they are different than us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a fundamental issue, but I do think that this is a problem, honestly, with some of these discussions, because sometimes if you describe something, people think you are making some normative judgment. So, for example, I will say, heterosexuality is the majority sexual orientation on average among humans. Okay. I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I mean, you know what? Like, this is like kind of strange, but I'm just gonna just really, I know a lot of young males. I'm in tech. Um, and I don't know how to say it. Well, I'm just gonna like put it out there because like this is gonna be in the paywall initially. Like they're just like, I wish I wasn't straight because it would be easier for me to raise and like dating and everything like this. And like get a pill to be gay, right?
Right.
And like, I'm Gen X, like
Yeah. That's
like,
not something previous generations would have ever said.
you see the cultural context has changed, but what I do tell people though, is like, okay, like obviously people can experiment and we're going to talk about different cultures in the past. But I do tell them, I'm just like, look, maybe you think that like you weren't born into easy mode. Easy mode being frankly like sex is easier, it's the same gender, like they understand me, all this stuff. And also there's some mentorship issues that I don't want to get into right now in tech. But I'm just like, you're straight. I know how it is. I'm straight. This is how it's always been. It's definitely my strong orientation. And just deal with it, right? Like this is who you are. And I'm not making a big moralistic judgment. I'm just saying like this is like the die you've been given. Maybe you can try to like change, and like there are people who've done anyway. My only point is like we have like these orientations and then we have these cultural contexts that change all around us, right? And then we have intersecting with it all these moralistic judgments to go in and out.
So let me ask you, Razib, how do you define heterosexual?
Okay. I would say like this is a little bit like the gender can this is not it. You just played a trick. I think you just like made me
This ain't my first rodeo.
I think you just like put me into a trap here. Okay, so the reality is like there are cases like you're in prison, where there are men who I would call heterosexual. They do not engage in heterosexual behavior. They engage in homosexual behavior because they're sexual, right? And at some point, like you have to have an outlet. But one day I woke up when I was 13, and you know what I'm saying. In contrast, like I have gay friends that knew from a very early age, or like sometimes in elementary school. I mean, I definitely had a straight orientation even when I was in elementary school in terms of like I kind of had a vague feeling, although I didn't hit puberty. And then I have gay friends who like they've said, "Oh yeah, I didn't have that one. I had the other." And then I had a lot of friends. I have friends who are some gay and some straight who like were very inchoate actually in pre-puberty. People are different, right? So there's an internal preference that you kind of sense, and then it develops over your lifetime, and it expresses in a social context. That's how I would say it.
Okay,
and then the behavior.
But what is heterosexual? What is the definition of that particular orientation? Because it's not purely attraction to the opposite sex, because other orientations have that. Bisexuals have that. Pansexuals have that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like it's not totally obligate, but like in an environment of like I think in some ways I have said, like I've been canceled so many times I can say whatever, right? But I have said that my generation, in some ways, in the United States of Gen X males, we're the straightest generation ever because there was still homophobia, right? But sexual revolution had happened.
Mm-hmm.
So women were available for us to have sex with as teenagers. That was accepted. But homosexuality, it wasn't like the 1950s or 60s, but still it was like,
They wouldn't kill you, but it would
be taboo,
social
right?
circle.
Whereas like in previous generations, and I've done the reading on this, like I mean there was like homoerotic homosexual behavior among straight men, right?
Yeah, exacand they just didn't call themselves anything.
It was just like it's not gay if you're not if you're the pitcher, or whatever, and like we can go into like the historical of that. So in my generation was very different. Like in fact, like candidly, like it's like we're like the straightest generation because like a lot of Zoomers, they have much more like experimentation.
They do. And I was going to say, Gen X is not just the straightest generation, they're probably the gayest generation too, because if you're gay as a Gen Xer, you're only expected to be gay, and playing around with
a lot of Gen X men do not think bisexual men exist.
Exactly.
Gen X gay men. They're very strong. They're very, very strident about that.
That's right. And of course, what we're seeing now as more of that social control lifts is you do see the heteroflexible and the pansexuals and the sexually fluid and you see this. And what I think is most interesting about this is that we're starting to see sex differences on these things, where women are more sexually fluid than men. And I believe that. I don't think that's just purely enculturation. I think that women are more flexible in their attractions, and we can talk about why that might be. But the point I was trying to make, though, when asking about heterosexuality, is that heterosexuality is the only sexual orientation that is defined by its aversions. So you're not attracted to members of the same sex, right? That's a key part of being straight. And if you think about it, from all the examples I give in the book, that in many ways could put you at a disadvantage. If you're absolutely not open to forming a sexual alliance with a member of your same sex, that's half the population that is not available to you as a social partner or whatever. And if you put it in ancient Greece, for example, if you simply refuse to participate in pederasty, which was that relationship, you would have missed out on all the mentoring that takes place in it. Now, obviously, of course, we're not going to emulate that. I have no interest in emulating that. I'm as creeped out by it as anybody else. But the idea being that orientation clearly has to be more flexible than we were led to believe. It has to be more able to be shaped and molded by the society. I think the aversion that we now associate with heterosexuality, that is more of culture speaking than biology. I do think that most men are attracted to women, and I do think that most women are attracted to men. But where the aversions come in, to me, that reeks of culture.
Yeah, I mean, when we know this, anyone who's been stationed in Afghanistan in the last 20 years knows.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's still here.
Mm-hmm.
It's still there. And that's in a society where it's like, and actually a lot of those pederast societies were extremely sex segregated.
Mm-hmm.
Athens, for example, like elite women were basically what we would call porta today, in this like Islamic societies. And Islamic societies, as many of you know, listeners out there, we're much more, the word liberal is a weird word to use, but homosexual behavior was actually like much more open in a lot of Islamic societies than they were in Europe. Partly just because sex segregation was just much stronger.
Right.
And so, that's sexual outlet. And then there was like some changes in the 19th and 20th century. And so there's a lot of...
You see that in animals too, right? There are some species that are very sex segregated, and they have a lot of sex within those sex segregated groups. And then when the two sex groups come together, they have sexual activity for the purpose of, fertilization, but then they go back to their sex segregated groups.
I want to talk about the history and get less anecdotal. I do have to say something really strange. I was actually in San Francisco recently, on business stuff, and I was hanging out with some friends, and I mean, I was just we've talked about this before. It's gay men in tech, they have a really cohesive bond. You know what I'm trying to say? And I'm not even saying this in a prurient way. I'm just saying this a single gender group of men, and it's just they're tight. Mm-hmm. Whereas us straight guys, we're cross-linked.
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say? There is no... I mean, I'm just going to be honest. I can't imagine my life being complete without a woman, and vice versa. But as anyone knows, men and women, we drive each other crazy, and then of course, in terms of between my bros, my straight male friends, obviously we're tight. But there's certain types of intimacy that aren't there. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it was weird to talk about it because I was just we're just different. And you don't, because I've had younger gay men in particular sometimes do not understand. Honestly, they do not understand the straight male experience because they didn't have to perform being us.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like my generation did.
They didn't have to try. Yeah, they didn't have to try. They didn't have to date women. Because sometimes they'll say things because I have a lot of young male friends that are gay. Not a lot, but I have a fair number. Okay, whatever. I don't want to make it seem weird, but you know what I'm saying. And they'll just be say something and because I'm trying to date or something. And they're just and I'm no, you don't understand. This is a woman, dude.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, how different can they be? Have you ever dated one? He's no. Do you ever plan to? no, hell no, and it's like, okay, there you go then. It's just like, just step off. Anyway, I just think that's interesting because you would like understand because you were, candidly expected to be like us. Like we
Right.
were the standard, and we're no longer the standard anymore. It's just everyone do what you want to do as thou wilt, right? And that's created like a totally different socialization that I've noticed. And it's not good or it's bad. It's just different. It's different. And it's weird because it's like I'm like sometimes I feel like a generational anthropologist.
Mm-hmm.
Because I hang out with a lot of founders, not a lot, but I hang out with a fair number of founders that didn't go to college that are 20 and that have been like running their company for 3 years. And, they're either straight or gay or asexual or whatever. And it's a whole they've come up in a whole different world. They don't remember before gay marriage.
Yeah, right. It always was.
They like read some of this stuff and they're just like,
yeah,
you remember that stuff? And I'm like, yeah, like I'm old, Anyway, sorry.
I agree with you 100% because the experience now of those who are coming up and coming out gay is very different than even just mine. I'm not that old. I'm a Gen Xer. And it's a very, very different kinds of experience. And but you touched on something about how, and this brings it back to sex. When you have dating relationships, particularly dating is what I'm talking about. I'm not even talking about marriage. I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about dating. The differences between the sexes, I think that's, and the genders, I should say, that's when it's at its most intense, is the dating, the courtship phase, right? Because social relationships, I have very close friendships with women, very close friendships with men, straight, gay, whatever. And then marriage is so far beyond just, genital sexual intercourse that then they're not so different either. Two gay men and two lesbians, straight couples, they have way more in common than they have in difference. But it's the dating phase, the rules around courtship and how you post that's really where you see this difference. And I used to always make the joke is, I don't know how you can really have a relationship with someone when you're not even the same gender. I don't know how you can make that work. You don't think the same way. You have, your approach to sex is different. I'm joking, of course. I'm
divorced. Trust me. No.
Yeah. That's what I mean. But it really is the courtship phase, the dating phase, when those differences are most intense. And to bring this conversation 100% full circle, we're back to the issue of monogamy. Because ultimately, what dating is feeling people out to see if you're going to form a dyad with them. It's not about sex. It really isn't. It doesn't mean you're not having sex. It doesn't mean that sex is important. It's really, are we going to form at least a long-term relationship? And that's the interesting part to me, because it's not inherently sexual, but it is so sexualized that, I don't know. I don't have the answer, but
yeah, I mean, I was telling a young friend of mine, this is like much more personal podcast than I was expecting to do, but just like we'll go there, is because like he was talking about relationships and he's had sexual relationships, but he hasn't had a serious relationship. Like, 28-year-old guy, like whatever, anonymous enough that I can say the age. And in our generation, I feel like by the time you're 28, you should have had, but this is actually much rarer today. Not rare, but this is not an uncommon pattern. I'll put it this way. And I was explaining to him, and I'm saying it symbolically, just because you have sex with someone doesn't mean you're one flesh, Like that's symbolic of something much deeper. And you haven't experienced that. And, maybe you don't want to. I'm not like here to like preach at you, but I think, I was basically, because there was something lacking in his life. And I'm like, that is what is lacking. Like, neither of us are Christians, but like, it's in the Bible, like, he cleaves, a man cleaves to a woman and becomes one flesh. And that can be the same sex too, same gender, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, it is like symbolic and and I feel like Jordan Peterson right now, but representative of something deeper in our society as a culture, what that is representing as a corporate unit. Right? Like, you can't, like, you testify against each other in court. Like, usually, like, family, you have children, you know what I'm saying? It's like, now there's, like, a generational connection. Like, this is the future of you. Like, now you are bound to the future of the human species through these small human beings, And so it's, like, this much bigger thing than copulation, which is necessary and foundational in some ways. Although, as couples grow older, a lot of them become frankly asexual, but they still love each other romantically. So how do we deal with all this complexity with these youth? And I'm just like, oh my God, I'm old.
No, I couldn't agree with you more of what you just said. The idea of that when two people do kind of decide to share their life together, they're more than the sum of their parts, right? Because they can do things together that they can never do separately. Whether it's and think about birds and nesting, but you think about animals and care, but just think about humans and rent. You got to pay your rent, right? It is much easier to share space with someone in a room when you're having sex with them, right? You do not mind sleeping in the same bedroom and sharing a closet as long as you're having sex. But you don't know any roommates who are not sexual, just roommates, no matter how close, that share a bed and share a closet, right? They never would. But something about having sex creates a different kind of bond. And that's that whole monogamy paradox, if I can borrow that phrase from Sue Carter, is that it really changes the nature of a relationship in ways that aren't in any way connected to sex, that have nothing to do with sexual intercourse or even the sex or gender of the individual. But when you're having sex with them, the rules are totally different in your relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe in the supernatural personally, but like the word spiritual does get at something that's ineffable and that's like holistic that we're trying to get at here.
Anybody who's had really good sex is at least temporarily spiritual.
That's fair, but that's I think Greeks have different words for these sorts of love, and we don't need to.
Yeah, right.
But like, let's talk about like homosexuality, gayness, and then like loop back to monogamy and like kind of close the loop, because I think, I think we've talked about a lot of different things, and I think I hope the listeners find it interesting, and I've probably done a little bit too much TMI, but whatever. And the science at the center, because the science is there, like that's the foundation here. You have a chapter on homosexuality, and homosexuality you mentioned because it's in animals and stuff like that. And there's like the gayness, the gay rights movement, the gay identity. Right. And one thing I remember, like it was 2006 or 2007, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran, said something where he said, "Well, we don't have gay people like you do," and everyone started laughing because like everyone's like, "Well, of course they have homosexual," which is true. Like everyone actually, like the Islamic world is pretty well known for its homosexual behavior. I think what he was trying to get at, although he might not have like understood it like in an articulate way, is they don't have a recognized gay identity like we have in the West. Exactly. So I think homosexual orientation, or whatever, how you want to say it, that preference is in there in a lot of people. It's always been in there in a lot of people. You mentioned things in Babylonia and elsewhere a long time ago. Okay, that was there. But we have created in the modern West a certain style of expression of that orientation in a relationship context, which is unique and distinct. And I want to go back to ancient Rome and Greece in particular. You were talking about pederasty. Kyle Harper has a book about sexuality in the ancient world, and Con and I talk. It's like, honestly, like I told Con, it's a disturbing book to me because the relationship between power and sex there is just like so perverted. And perverted is literally like there's like child prostitutes all over the place. And children slaves in cages, and you can have sex with them. And basically the idea is like, in the ancient world, and actually much of the Islamic world today, and to some extent other parts of the world, it's about like whether you're penetrative or being penetrated. And so like, I know Caligula was mentioned, not Caligula, Claudius didn't ever engage in homosexuality with his slaves. And that was kind of weird. It was like, no, some of the biography.
What's wrong with you, dude?
Yeah, so basically the idea is like, just like a normal, like red-blooded Greco-Roman man would have sex with, young male slaves, often, boys or, teens.
And as long as you weren't penetrating a Roman citizen, it was fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like, that to them was like what they were talking about. And like, they were very tolerant of that, but they were not tolerant of, say, Elagabalus, the 3rd century emperor who was a catamite. Right. So an emperor as a catamite, so that means he's passive. Right. And there's like, I mean, some of this is probably made up, but like, they're like, oh, like he wanted to talk to a surgeon about creating a vagina, and like, all this.
It's the same thing, because Ahmadinejad wouldn't have a problem with people having sex. He'd have a problem with them waving a gay pride parade, and they might be celibate, but they're affirming.
It's the social disruption of the society that's based on a man and a woman. And so that's why, transitions of trans is okay in Iran, because it maintains the social ideal of that binary dyad, right?
Right.
And so and I think Americans, like candidly, we don't know about other cultures. Like a lot of people don't read history, and they just try to interpret everything in American,
Right.
like late 20th century, early 21st century terms. And so we didn't understand that. But like, we're seeing like homosexual behavior all across the world, but it instantiates in different ways in different cultures, right?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. That's right. And that's, to me, is the universal that speaks to biological. And then the differences speak to cultural influences. And they're both valid. They're both real. They're part of our experience. An attraction to a certain kind of sex. And the other thing is that when you have pederasty or ancient Rome or whatever, the attraction is so focused on the genital penetration that you wouldn't even call these individuals same-sex attracted. They're attracted to an ass that looks a certain way, if I can be crude, right? It's really quite specific. It has nothing to do with gay identity or gay bonding or anything like that. But because it didn't violate any norms, they were free to explore that particular attraction. And so your attractions, are very vague. The wiring for our attractions is very, very vague, and they're influenced by your childhood experiences and everything else. But then the cultural gets in on it and then trims it a little bit, right? And kind of hems it in a little bit. And because of, societal expectations. And I think it comes down to social control, really, because, why else would Ahmadinejad care about someone raising a pride flag, except that it violates this norm, right? It doesn't matter what the individual is actually doing in private, because if he did, there's people who do that anyway. Probably Ahmadinejad's done it. That's not the problem. The flaunting of social control, that's the problem. And it's the same thing, by the way. So transgender individuals have always existed, right? And even the correction, the gender reassignment is not brand new, right? We're looking at 100 years of history on that surgical procedure. And it was always fine when the person really mimicked the sex that they were, acquiring. As long as if your goal was to pass, then that was fine too, because that didn't disrupt the social order. We were very compassionate towards transsexuals, this is what we called them, right?
Yep.
But transgender individuals now are realizing that they're never going to fit the buckets perfectly, so they're going to play around with it. They're going to acquire masculine and femininity in whatever way makes sense to them, and that's the problem. Now you're violating social norms because you're not fitting into one or the other bucket, and we don't know what to do with you. We don't have the right labels. What pronoun should I use? All of these things. That's why it's upsetting, is it violates the social order.
Yeah, and I think I will maybe like a little bit of argument with you here at the end about that sort of stuff, because I do think that this is a discussion that needs to be had, and not in a hateful way, but we just talk about like what we as a society want, and maybe people disagree, and we just need to talk about it. And it's a democratic society, things happen, Supreme Court will make decisions, like people who are against gay marriage, have to accept it, right? And vice versa. Maybe other things will happen. There are people who don't want to who don't have children. The child free movement, which, you're not a member of, but they're pretty pissed about child tax credits. But you know what? Fuck them, because I'm just gonna say it, because our kids are gonna make sure that their retirement goes well. Anyway, I don't want to get into that detail, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, sure.
We make choices as a society about what we value, right? But before I get to that, I want to ask you about years ago, and my friend Steve Phelps, actually, who I think I mentioned earlier before we were recording. He's a professor here at UT. He did a op-ed with one of the authors of the Gay Was. So homosexuality is behavior or whatever, however you define it. Gay identity. The category, I haven't looked deeply into the literature recently. It's moderately heritable, but not very, 25% heritability or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's concordance between identical twins, but it's not like height or something, right?
Right.
So that indicates that there's some biological issues going on here. It might not necessarily be genetic, because obviously things happen in utero. So it could be biological, but not heritable, not genetic. And then they have been looking for genes, and they found some statistically significant genes. And what they found about those genes, from what I remember in the paper, and again, I haven't followed the literature, is when they're found in people that are just heterosexual, just vanilla heterosexual in the British UK Biobank, those people tend to have more sexual partners. And so the hypothesis here is it's involved in some sort of sexual development, and occasionally people tend to be homosexual or bisexual, I guess. part of this is like, I just wonder if, let's just say they're more pansexual and more open,
Yeah.
and express it in a certain way. Because a lot of these behavioral things kind of like hard to get a handle on. But like at the time, there was actually a lot of controversy, and I was at the American Society of Human Genetics meetings, and there was a lot of hostility from the audience, even though, I mean, like, the lead researchers were gay. They were they were gay men mostly. I mean, I don't think there was any lesbians, but you know what I'm saying? But they were getting like a lot of crap incoming from the audience, and like people were shaking and getting angry. And I was just like, I mean, okay. I mean, like Dean Hammer, who I think is gay at Arizona State, he was like early on in this stuff, and it was just like people were just interested in themselves and how they came to be.
Right.
You know,
Exactly. Yeah.
then like, it became like highly politicized in the audience because they're like, "Are you targeting gay people?" And like one of the guys is like, "Well, I mean, it's like he didn't really want to say like I'm gay, he's gay, he's gay." Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
But
because originally the goal of a lot of that was just to if we could find a biological explanation for something, then it would at least eliminate the whole, oh well, you were sexually abused as a child, or oh you're just trying to be different or get attention. So it legitimized the gay orientation to search for that. But then it very quickly, the politics flipped to, okay, now are you trying to breed it out? Are you trying to fix it? Are you trying to? And the thing is, I talk about this in chapter 7 of the book, where if you read the literature on the mechanism of homosexuality, it's really hard not to read it as if they're saying, they're looking for what went wrong. What's wrong about this? What's different? And so I understand the defensiveness because, if you frame it that way, you're going to make people a little suspicious about what your goals are. And so I think it's changed a little bit. But to be honest, I think it's changed even further since then, since the time of, when it was all in the X chromosome. Everyone was looking for, what is it, XQ28 or whatever it was, whatever the genes are there.
That was for the New York Times in the year 2000, right?
The gay gene, whatever. So we've moved now to this diffusely, genetic trait or whatever. But the idea being now, how it takes shape and are we going to breed it out? But I think the understanding of animal behavior has a lot to say about this debate, because what we see in animals is a much more generic, sex drive that then takes shape in these different environments. And I think that's what we're going to see. Of course, as you said, there's a distribution. There'll be people who will be oriented more one way or the other, but you're going to be impacted by your environment, and it's going to take shape in that way. And, so the classic study that was done, well, there were two studies. One that found a lot of victims of sexual abuse grow up to be homosexual. That was thought through the 80s as something that was true. And of course, the why that came to be has long since been debunked. But a colleague of mine, her name is Kathy Whittam. If you ever want to have a really interesting psychologist on your show, you might consider her. So she studies what's called the cycle of violence, and she had children who were abused at an early age, and she has followed, and the data set's like 800, and she has followed them now for 30 plus years. And she has not perfectly, but a very well-matched control group. So these are kids from the same environment, same zip code, same social economic everything, and about similar size, 800, and followed them. And so you're looking at what's different. She's found one thing is that abused people are not destined to become abusers. That was the first big finding, is that hurt people is what they used to always say. So it's not so simple. When you can control for these other variables, it goes away. But the second thing she found is that children who are sexually abused are not more likely to become gay, like identify as gay, but they are more likely to have at least one same-sex experience. And when they look deeper, they found that people who were sexually abused are more likely to go through a phase of sexual exploration. And that would include members of the same sex as well as opposite sex. And then they'll end up wherever they end up. They're not more likely to end up gay or straight, but they go through that exploratory phase. And you can talk about why that is. One theory is it's a reclaiming of their sexual autonomy and identity. Another one is that promiscuity is just like a side effect of abuse, whatever the reason is. To me, I find it fascinating because it speaks of that flexibility, of that, okay, and during that exploratory phase, before I have to choose what I am, humans have this. And the idea that they were abused is what kind of allowed that exploratory phase to take shape. But they still ended up wherever they were going to, at least statistically speaking. So I think that's a great study. And I wish more people knew about that study, because it shows that that, first of all, you're not destined, your childhood experiences don't destine you to anything sexual. But it also shows that an exploratory phase, while normal, is, can be impacted by some of these adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah. Okay. I could go into a behavior genetic like just like a tangent, not a tangent, but actually like a rabbit hole. I'm gonna skip that. I'm gonna hold my piece on this.
Okay.
I think some of the listeners are gonna be like, Razib, blah 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 blah. Why are you talking about behavior genetics? Well, you know what? I want to talk about monogamy. And I want to like kind of like not argue with you, but like say my piece and maybe like defend some of Khan's viewpoints. Although I'm not sure if we like necessarily disagree too much. But okay, so I am I've never been just so listeners know, because like some people who are like right wing, like we're like left wing and they change. I've always been like either libertarian or conservative. I've never really been on the left, but I've never really had a problem with gay people because honestly my parents didn't talk to me about it. When I first found out about it when I was 10, I was like, okay, that's weird, but that was like my main reaction. Gay marriage, like I supported it back in the 90s when it was like weird.
Mm-hmm.
And mostly it's just because like it was okay, like growing up in our generation, people where it's like there was tragedies because they had to hide their relationship and then one person gets sick, like these sorts of things. Like this is what really impelled a lot of us to just be like just come on, like let's just like formalize this, get it out of the shadows. And so my attitude with gay people in general, whatever, is just like, just let them be, right? Like no one bugs me about, or like, okay, like I was in an interracial marriage. That's what we used to call it back then. You know what I'm saying? No one bugs me about that or bugged me about it. No one cares, Similarly, that was my attitude, right? And so I did support gay marriage actually very early on. I wasn't like super militant about it, but I was like always like, yeah, I mean, just they got the same rights, whatever. I mean, they love someone and it's different sex, whatever. Like the logic of that is clear. But I was always skeptical about polygamy. Okay. And the reason is one, polygamous societies are quite different. There's some like correlated differences, right? And so, for me, gay marriage is just marriage, except they're gay. It's actually like a simple, you know what I'm trying to say? It's just like a simple. It would be like if in a gay world it was like straight marriage. It's just like, okay, like easy to understand. When you're talking about polygamy, though, for example, or like let's say like a like formal recognition of say like graph like poly relationships, which I have friends in the Bay Area that are in that. Okay, like our whole society is gonna be like reorganized top to bottom.
Yeah.
So it's like I am actually like pretty like strident that like gay marriage is fine, in terms of like it's a simple like modification to the same system, whereas polygamy is fundamentally different. Now, I'm talking about social legal polygamy here. Okay. I am well aware that there are cheaters and people have different relationships and different understandings. And there are people who are married who are in poly triads and tetrads and all these other things. Right. But one of the aspects in Khan's book that I think was very good was he pointed out that the emergence of Greco-Roman monogamy had to do with legitimacy and inheritance. And some of this is unjust. Like, I actually don't think that the way bastards were treated was necessarily just. But the idea is the society needs to have rules to organize the transmission of property and social relations. Now, my late friend David Bowes, who was a gay man, he did propose many decades ago, before gay marriage happened, that we just turn marriage into a civil contract of some sort. And to some extent, in the Islamic world, that's what a nikah is. Islamic
right.
is a civil contract. It's not a sacrament. But operationally, it's not just like a simple contract between two people. Like we were talking earlier, it's to become one flesh. It's like representing something as a corporate unit about our society, our liberal democratic society, about the value that we put on these dyads, even if we breach that sanctity or whatever you want to call it, right? And when I was younger, I'm not sure I would be as vociferous about that. And as a divorced person, like I failed, like it didn't work,
I mean,
but
why do you paint it that way? I don't paint, the termination of one relationship, that it had a certain amount of time that was less than the length of your life. Why is that a failure? I don't get that. I
Yeah,
think that you failed in a certain set of societal expectations. But for example, there's lots of animals that get together for a breeding season, right? And then they're dulled and they move on, and maybe they'll get back.
Not an animal. I am not an animal, Nathan.
You are
But,
definitely an animal. You're a vertebrate.
I'm a particular type of animal, and we have certain, I think, goals and ideals. I honestly, candidly, a lot of it just has to do with children.
Right. And
I
that's why it's different. Let me just tell you this, Razib. I am in the gay community in New York City. So I know people with every kind of arrangement in their relationship that you can imagine. And let me tell you something. The no rules, no labels does not get you out of the drama at all. And the jealousy and the rule breaking and the cheating, and it's all there. So they're really not that different in that way. And so the idea of creating marriage as a contract does make sense a little bit, because that way you're acknowledging what's different. And what is different is the sharing of resources. It's that social monogamy that I was talking about, how you get together, you have a homestead, you have children if you do, and you have an extended future and that kind of a thing. And so I think it's interesting that the no labels or no, this movement, it really is going to come back to the same issues that straight couples have always had. And how permanent is this? And what's
gay marriage opened the door to gay divorce.
That's right. That's right. Gays were never getting divorced before 2010.
Yeah, and so I mean, going back to like polygamy. So, for example, a lot of social conservatives would say, well, gay marriage is against like God's law and it's against nature, and it's just like a total radical disruption. And even if like in the United States they're against polygamy because they're from like a Christian background, Western Christian background, they'd be like, well, I mean, a lot of societies have been polygamous. At least that's like within the normal range. And there's polyandry, there's polygamy, there's different types of polygamy. Like in African polygamy, there might be like the women have very independent homes, whereas in say like Arabian style polygamy, it's like they're all like in the same compound and whatnot. But my point here is that is a way some societies are organized. But for a liberal democratic society, that is not optimal. And some people say, well, if we're like, I'm sorry, for example, like I just give you a real example. Freddie DeBoer, who I do enjoy his writing and I do subscribe to his Substack, he's been saying for like 15, 20 years, once you have gay marriage, you should start to think about like polygamy and legalizing it. And he says it as a positive thing because he's like, there's no moral reason to just have monogamy. I'm not making a moral case. I'm making like a sociological case where, we're talking about egalitarianism. Polygamy opens the door to a level of sexual inegalitarianism. And I'm focusing mostly on straight people right now just to make it simple. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I think there's going to be like more violence, crime, lower trust. I think there's going to be a lot of other things. We can make the same sorts of arguments about cousin marriage. That's a totally different podcast. But these things, even if you don't think that they're immoral, and even if they exist in a lot of societies, we as a society can say, you know what, that's not going to, we're going to clamp down on this particular individual liberty in relation to the law, right? Because we're never going to ban cousins from having sex in this country, but we can discourage marriage of cousins, whether socially or legally. Similarly, we're never going to ban men in particular of high status, like, I don't know, Sergey Brin or whatever, from having these like polygamous relationships. But we as a society have decided, you know what? You're not going to get yourself this legal harem and produce like, 100 little kids. Sorry, Elon, mm-hmm. It's not legally recognized. And so I just think like social conservatives, they do have a point there. It's just that it does get wrapped up into views about gays that are just, frankly, just not very popular among younger people. It's just like they don't have purchase, right? I worry that actually causes problems with the argument about monogamy. Does that make sense? So anyway.
Yeah, it does. I think I approach this as a biologist, right? So just describing the natural world is what we try to do. And public policy has a very different goal, which is what kind of society do we want to build collectively? So you can discourage or encourage certain behaviors, reward them. And whether or not polygyny, and you're saying polygamy, but I think you mean polygyny, because the other way around, polyandry.
I mean, polyandry is not very.
It's not very common, and you said let's focus on straight people. And the reason why that's different is the power dynamic that has between men and women, right? And the historical power dynamic and resources, would be unequal. But in a society that is getting more flat when it comes to, at least for the genders and so forth, the idea that we could revisit the debate on polygyny and polygamy, I think we're going to hear that more and more.
We're already hearing it.
Yeah, I don't think that there's necessarily a moral evil there. There's certainly not a biological imperative either way, but that doesn't mean that there aren't pluses and minuses for the society. And so does the individual flourishing, how is that impacted by allowing this? Well, here's the problem is we don't have a lot of data on that. Like if a society allows multiple marriage, individual marriage, gay marriage, if everything goes, what does that allow maximum liberty? Does that lead to maximum flourishing? I don't know. A lot of libertarians would say the more freedom, the more flourishing. So this is going to cut across the different right-left divide because
it will.
Yeah. But goal-oriented policy making is very different than just describing the natural world. So I'm not going to do a lot of policy stuff because I'm a biologist.
I just want to put that out there in terms of
No, you're right. You're right. We have opened that door. So we got to have that conversation.
Yeah. And this is an issue where feminists and some social conservatives are going to be like, okay, monogamy, yes,
Well, to be honest, I think it'd be a really good thing that the political siloing breaks down a little bit, because right now, if you tell me what you think about guns, I'll tell you what you think about abortion. And that's bullshit that all of these views are just completely wrapped up on the right and the left. And the United States has it much more than other countries where every single issue predicts every other issue when it comes to the major issues. So the more that we can unite the right and the left, whether it's the crazies or the normals, would be good, because we got to break down these silos. It's not helpful at all to getting anything done on any of the issues, right? And I think the right would agree with that too, right?
Yeah. I think we all as Americans, agree with that sort of it, that we have a problem with negative polarization. And it's, part of it is if we just get off the fucking X, and just talk to people, we're much more humane with each other. It's common sense why, we're much more humane.
Yeah, no, Razib, and you and I are a perfect example. I think we're on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And I know many people who flock with me, they dislike a caricature of you. They don't know you. They don't know you well enough to like or dislike, but they dislike the caricature of you.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little spicy on Twitter, but I speak for a lot of people who keep their peace. So, that's part of it, honestly.
Yeah, there's a role for that.
I mean, there is me as the individual, and I think as the individual, I'm not that atypical, but I do have an atypical bundle of beliefs, and I will put them out there. And I do have to say, Nathan, I do appreciate it. You have stood up for just my right to just candidly speak. I think today it's not as big of a deal, honestly, but there was a period 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And, this is unrelated to our conversation, but I was some of the funniest things were people who were just such close friends with me, and people I even mentored, encouraged in grad school, denouncing me, and my other friends were what the fuck is going on here, and that was very disturbing. And I do have to say, much respect to you. You have always been who you were, and that's not always as people out there know, that's not always common. So whatever ideological disagreements we have, which we do have, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
We're both scientists. We both want to know the truth of the world. The conclusions we draw from it might differ. Lifestyles are different. I don't really think that matters. I mean, honestly, you're married and live a very bourgeois life, and I wish I had that right now. But that's a whole different thing. But I think we've had a great conversation here. I think it's the longest podcast I've ever had.
Oh, and I'm honored. I've had a great time.
Yeah. And this is the book. I'm just gonna name check it again. The Sexual Evolution. Provocative Look at Sexual Behavior. It is provocative. There's a lot of stuff in there. If you have a biological sciences background, you'll recognize some of it. If you don't, it's gonna be candidly a little mind blowing. and just go with it. Take from it what you want, right? Like you're putting the information out there and you're letting people draw their conclusions. You interpolate a little of your own self, but you got to have the authorial voice. And so I think that's fine. And yeah, I mean, I think this is really great work. It's really provocative. I mean, it's a provocative book with provocative in the subtitle, but it is actually provocative, and I hope it gets the discussion going. And I think that's what we need more of in the society today. Going forward, as we're recording this, there's an administration change, and some people have hopes, some people have fears, but we all live in the same country. And what they say, we're gonna stick together or we're gonna like hang apart.
Yeah.
And I don't want to seem like too,
I'm worried. I'm very worried, and not just about the administration, about the polarization, about our ability to live together peacefully. As really, social media was supposed to bring us together. That was what the promise was, and it really has not. It has really, really amplified differences, and it's made, as I said, it's shaped people's views to more match their ideological peers, and that can't be good. It can't be good for truth, but it definitely can't be good for society. So. You and I coming together, let's model this. More people, and some of my closest colleagues, we disagree on a lot are
role models. We're role models, people. But I do have to say one of the things, before we close off, one of the things that I sometimes do is I don't really know what a specific topic, what a specific issue trending, whether it's right or left, and I'll just express my opinion. And then, like, it apparently happens to be, my opinion is the liberal opinion or something. And, like, people will be like, you fucking shit lib. And I'm just like, what the hell? But it's, like, something really banal that has, like, nothing to do with politics. But somehow it's gotten polarized. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Like, have you seen that where you're just like, wait a second, why is this conservative? Why is this liberal? Like, what? It's just someone just decided to glom onto it. And then everyone just kind of, like, positive feedback loops to their own side. And, it's just like, it's really dispiriting. But like, I'm not gonna lie, like, I like just like, I don't know. Some of my friends are like, they're like, you just need to get over yourself. I like poking at my own side because
you
like
poke the bear. But that's
like,
you got to get people to clarify why they believe what they believe, because that's the first step. That's the first step to opening minds and having a real conversation and say, why do you believe that? Why do you think this is what would happen? And that's when conversation begins. But it's also when people put up the defenses because they want to know why you're asking. They're like, well, what are you trying to say? And, when people can sit down with a beer and talk about these things, and I think people like me have an advantage because I grew up in what is a very conservative part of the country, and now I live in a very liberal part. So I can speak both languages. I go back and visit my mom, and I have to interact with people who are very different than I am now but I recognize that. And that's why I tell people who are born and raised in New York, I'm like, go live somewhere else. You can come back. New York will be here, but go live somewhere else and meet people that look different, that think different. And your own views will be more rich for having engaged with the other side. You might even change your mind on an issue or two.
Yeah, but 99.99% same DNA.
Yeah.
But with the same biology, and like yet out of that, like, is this like endless forms of culture.
Yeah.
Most beautiful or not.
Beautiful, yeah.
All right, Dr. Lents, I will let you go.
Razib, thank you very much.
Yeah. Obviously I think like people could tell like we enjoyed this conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know that some people are gonna be like, ew, like a little offended about this or that. But you know what? If you're not engaging ideas that offend you every now and then, maybe you're not engaging ideas.
That's right. Amen.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks a lot, Razib. Take care.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite